old days, everything was hidden.
Right.
Now it's like right out there.
It is. It's hidden in plain sight, as we like to say. And
Yeah.
when, in the preface of this book, that we actually it's barely being distributed now. It's online at disclosureproject.org and a couple other places, and people can get it by calling 888-ET-CSETI. CSETI is our organization. But in the preface, I say, look, I had a meeting at the Pentagon with one of the highest-ranking generals there. He was head of a major intelligence unit, and he told me this story about how his father had known about some extraordinary secrets in this sort of shadow government cabal that was running things. And this general turned to me and to my military advisor and said, Dr. Greer, I thought the old man was a kook. He's talking about his father now, who is a government official. And he says, finally, my father killed himself because no one would listen. And he was so despondent over the weight of this. And he turned to me, and this was the first meeting I had with this general. He turned to me and he said, I didn't think anything that man was saying could have been true until I got into this position. And the position he had, by the way, was the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, one of the most powerful entities at the Pentagon. And when he looked at me in the eyes and said that, I just felt this chill run down my spine, and I thought, well, I can understand that. Even my own children, how much of this can they even believe is happening? Because, here is this man who was saying that even his own father, it was just too much for him to take until he got to be in his 50s, and he was sitting there in this very powerful position at the Pentagon, and he saw firsthand how he was being stiff-armed aside when he tried to look into this issue and how he was being lied to. So, it's a very steep learning curve, and for many people, it really sounds like, sort of a conspiracy theory or something that's just kind of too far out to be true until you start really looking at the facts and the evidence, and you see that it is true. And one of the things I've tried to do with the Disclosure Project, disclosureproject.org, is to put out there the testimony of people over 40, 50 years of military and intelligence history, top-secret witnesses who have seen events and seen projects and have seen the cover-up firsthand, talk about how that is effected, up to and including assassinations and intimidation and deceiving high officials. One of the big shocks for me in the 90s that I share in this book was being asked to go up and do a briefing for the sitting CIA director, who I had been told was being denied access to these projects. And
that was William Colby at the time, right?
No, this was actually Woolsey, R. James Woolsey,
okay.
Who was President Clinton's first CIA director. And he was the sitting CIA director at the time, and here I am, an emergency physician in North Carolina, and I'm going, what the hell am I doing briefing a CIA director? And he, when we met, he made it very clear that he and the president were being denied access to these projects, even though they were going on. And, of course, subsequent to that, I ended up meeting with Senator Claiborne Pell, Senator Richard Bryan, who had been on the Intelligence Committee for the Senate, and many other high officials in the Congress and in other governments who had told me the same thing. In fact, Minister of Defense Paul Hellyer just told me that he knew nothing of this, and he was quite sure that Prime Minister Trudeau and Prime Ministers Pierce and Trudeau that he had worked under also did not know about this subject, even though there are Canadian projects dealing with this issue.
Let's go back then to the beginning, if we can, your boyhood experiences, and lead into some of the things that you found, of course, to be just revelations that have affected you. But you said at this young age of about 8 or so, things started happening for you. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, this was around the time that my uncle, my mom's oldest brother, was designing the lunar module that took the first man to the moon. As you know, he was the senior project engineer at Grumman that had the contract to build the lunar module. Mm-hmm. So, I was very interested in space and the idea that humans were going to be going into space, because I had my closest uncle building the thing that was going to land there on the moon. So around that time, I had a sighting of broad daylight of a silvery disk, seamless. It appeared and then disappeared. It didn't just fly in. And there were some other boys with me at the time. And, of course, my parents, who were very reductionist and very rational, said, oh, well, this is the young boy's imagination. But, children know what they see.
Sure.
And I was a sharp little guy, and I said, "Oh my God, I just saw a UFO." So I became very interested in this, and I began to have some experiences at night in the lucid dream state with these extraterrestrial beings that were on that craft. And I've never talked about this before, frankly.
I know that. In all the interviews, I've never heard you talk about this specifically.
Yeah, no, and you know, it sort of harkens back to this Lockheed Skunk Works guy that we've been working with for some years, who related to me a similar experience he had when he was working under Kelly Johnson at Lockheed, where he had this experience in the state of consciousness that some would call a lucid dream with these non-human life forms. And people say, well, they weren't, how do you know they were extraterrestrial and biological? It's because there's a physical component to the experience as well as a conscious component. And I didn't really understand it as an 8 or 9 year old boy, but about 8, 9 years later, when I was 17, I became very, very sick because of an injury to my left leg. And I relate this in this book, The Hidden Truth, Forbidden Knowledge. And I had a near-death experience. And instead of going to the pearly gate someplace, my great love was space. And so I went out into space, and I had an extraordinary experience. First, of what some would call cosmic consciousness, where the mind that I experienced as my own was one with the mind of the universe, the awake being that's there. And it was beautiful, and there was nothing frightening about it. It was just a stunningly beautiful experience. And subsequently, I had an experience with these two very enlightened beings. Some would call them avatars or kind of manifestations of divinity, that approached me and said, a number of things. But one of the things they said is that you could either come with them or I could return back to the earth. And I thought to myself, well, I had enough presence of mind, even though I wasn't raised in a religious family, to say, well, what's your will? What should I do? Yeah. And I was told that I should come back to the earth, and with that I did. But not before I went into a state of awareness where the only way I can explain it is sort of a unity state of consciousness or God consciousness, and it was beautiful. And at that point, I never was afraid of death again. You know, I always joked that my parents were very devout atheists. They didn't believe in anything. You couldn't put it in a test tube, it didn't exist. But this experience was so transformative at age 17 that I began to really search what it meant to be awake, what it meant to be a human. And subsequently, I learned some meditation techniques, some very ancient ones from the Vedas, the ancient Vedic Sanskrit literature, and began to practice a technique where I could go into that state of cosmic consciousness frequently. In fact, I'll never forget the time that my teacher was instructing me in this technique, and I sat down and I, went right back into that state of unbounded, pure consciousness that you hear about, the sort of samadhi state. And he looked at me at the end of the meditation and says, "You went there, didn't you?" And I said, "Yeah, weren't you supposed to?" And of course, he kind of laughed. He said, "Yes, but people generally don't." And then I explained to him that I'd had this near-death experience where the veils of the material cosmos were stripped away, and I was left with this oneness with the awake mind of the cosmos. And he says, "Well, no wonder you can arrive there easily." So this led to a number of extraordinary things over the next few months. The chief one being that I was up in the mountains of North Carolina when I was out at college at age 18 now, 6 months later, and I decided to go up to the top of this mountain and meditate at sunset. And as I went up to the very top of this over 5,000-foot mountain, I looked in the southwest, and here was this exact same spaceship that I saw when I was 8 years old.
Oh, my.
And it appeared, materialized, connected with me, and then dematerialized. And the only thing that I thought was, oh, my God, well, they're back. I mean, that's all I really thought. And I sat and meditated, and it got dark. And at the end of the meditation, I went into this enormous, unbounded state of consciousness again. And after that, an amazing contact happened.
Well, Stephen, we'll talk about that. And I got to tell you, I've never heard you this open before. Fascinating. I'm George Norrie. We'll be